Hi, beautiful people. My name is Chris Jones, and I'm going to be introducing a science channel for COP26.tv. So, our goal is really simple. We're going to be talking to scientists from across the UK, and we're going to be looking at the current research with regard to climate change and trying to understand why 2050 is probably a deeply inappropriate target, and breaking down the science for you so that it is really, really easy for you to explain to other people and for you to understand and make decisions yourselves. So I'm here with a fantastic scientist from Imperial College studying atmospheric pollution, Pete Knapp. So hi, Pete.
Hi, good to speak to you.
So I'm going to kind of get stuck in straight away. So why atmospheric pollution? Why study atmospheric pollution?
Well, my project is not as broad, not as specific as atmospherics. My work is predominantly on air quality, but it's not really about atmospherics. It's about the charge distributions of breath aerosol. And when we breathe out, we breathe out some particles you can see and some particles that you can't see. And the particles that you can't see we don't know very much about in terms of how well they're charged, so the kind of static, whether they're positive or negative. And that's really important because that tells you how they move, how they stick to things, how quickly they grow, and that kind of stuff. But that idea expands into atmospherics as well. So the charge of an aerosol in the ambient atmosphere can determine how quickly it grows and where it moves. And those things are really important when we discuss climate. So my project is actually not related to climate, to atmospherics, but the outcome of the research will be relevant to that.
Fantastic. And in terms of like your knowledge and research, I mean, I've read some of your research, and you've been talking about like different sources of pollution, so obviously relevant to what you're studying. And something that kind of comes to my mind is, what are the biggest sources of sort of pollution that you're aware of?
Yeah, that's a really good question because it varies so much depending on where you are and when you are as well. So I spent 3 years working as a maths teacher in Beijing, and that's where I got most of my interest in air pollution. I looked out the window and sometimes I couldn't see the next building. And it took me a year of being there before I realized that it was air pollution. I thought it was kind of mist or just the climate there or something, but no, it was pollution. And it's a big mixture of stuff. In Beijing, the predominant component I thought was from coal-fired power stations. And even though I know that that's a big contributor, in the cities, it's also home cooking and home heating. So the way that people cook and eat in Beijing varies massively dependent on wealth. So a lot of the people there who are burning things in their home, that pollutes the streets, and because Beijing is kind of in a basin, it sticks in there and it doesn't move very easily. And we might think that that's just an issue with Beijing, but in the UK we have serious issues with combustion as well. So in the UK, 8% of homes burn wood, but it causes 40% of the primary pollutants in the air. So combustion of fossil fuels is a big deal, but combustion of wood in the UK is an enormous contributor to air pollution here. Now, in different countries, we have different major sources of air pollution. So in the Sahara, we're going to see air pollution predominantly from sand blowing around. Whereas in Europe, the biggest contributors tend to come from agriculture. And that's a bit of an interesting one because the ammonia that's used in agriculture mixes with nitrous oxides from traffic, and it mixes with sulfur oxides from coal and other combustion of fossil fuels. When they mix together, they produce a pollutant that is really quite bad for our health. So when you have a mixture of agriculture and cities, they combine to make a pollution that is really quite toxic in London and in major cities. But the main driver for that is in agriculture, in the way that they use ammonia there. But by cutting down on traffic as well, that cuts down one of the components of what is the predominant source of air pollution in the UK.
Right. So we've got kind of wood burning, coal burning, which are still kind of predominant sources of heat in a big parts of the world. Where I'm in Wales, we're in a kind of basin, and we have that kind of. There is a definite difference when you drive into it. You can actually feel it in the air. As an asthmatic myself, I can feel that in the air. And then you've got the sources of agriculture, and then the combining with the sort of vehicle pollution as well. What component? So we've got vehicles on the road. What about air travel and sea travel?
So in terms of air travel, this is another really important fact. We don't know enough about aviation pollution to argue for airport expansions, and we don't have a very good measurement for what's called ultrafine particles. They are so small that a lot of the typical measurement tools, the sensors that we use around the UK, are not well equipped to measure this type of pollution. It's too small. But they come out of planes a lot. And when for Heathrow, for example, the flight path for landing and takeoff really covers all of London, right? Millions of people living there, and we're all unaware of the ultrafine pollution that's raining down from aeroplanes and surrounding airports. This is one component of the problem with aviation fuels. Contrails, again, are one of the potentially warming or potentially cooling aspects of aviation. My supervisor, in fact, was interviewed by the BBC, and an article of his came out in the news today about that. And when we talk about shipping, the fuels that shipping uses are really low grade. And with low grade fuels, when you burn them, you get a lot of sulfur oxides coming out. And they are a driver of acid rain. And they also a precursor of what's called PM 2.5, which is a type of pollution, which is like a very small, fine dust. And when that gets into your lungs, it can go into your blood, goes from your blood into your organs, and from your organs it can cause organ failure. It can cause strokes, cancers, disease, heart disease. If you look at the biggest causes of death on the WHO, a lot of those can be attributed to what's caused from air pollution. And in fact, 1 in 5 deaths is attributed to air pollution around the world. So it's a really big issue. When we look at shipping, especially with cruises, when we have a look around Norway, south of Spain, Italy, and if you have a look at a map of that, a pollution map of those areas, they get really stung with air pollution from cruises. Pollution from shipping, pollution from cruises. I mean, cruises also pollute the oceans by dumping all of their raw sewage and all the rest of it. So, yeah, there's a lot to think about. But one of the issues, I think, with a lot of these things is that you need to have so much awareness to know what the problems are. Someone who's going on a cruise may not even consider air pollution. Rightfully so.
And they're probably not going to mention it in their sales brochures.
Of course not.
So that's why this conversation is quite an important one then, to highlight that.
Yeah. Even though I don't suppose everyone who's going to go on a cruise is going to watch this, and anyone going on a cruise is going to have an awareness, the issues are going to be solved by, I would argue, more regulation on the fuels that they use. And in other words, to give people fewer options, right? it's giving people the right options. People will have that sense of freedom when they know that the options that they can choose from. You don't have to think about spending that evening researching whether it's going to be ethical or ecocidal. That's not an expectation that should be given to the public, but it should be dealt with, I think, in government.
You mentioned something earlier about contrails either heating or cooling, and I've heard that there are some other sort of chemicals that can either have a heating or a cooling effect, and obviously that's kind of relevant to climate change and obviously the global warming that we're focusing on and what COP is focusing on. So, are there any sort of pollution particulates that have an effect on temperature?
Yeah, if you have a contrail, it depends on the time of day and the altitude that they're created, and they can either be warming or cooling, and by shifting when and where flights are taking off or landing or cruising, that can have a big effect on the cooling effects that they could potentially have. But I don't think the magnitude of that cooling effect is going to be strong enough to deal with the kinds of warming that we'll see from increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There's a big lag in warming and carbon in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide. So the 420 or whatever it is parts per million in the atmosphere at the moment of CO2 does not reflect the temperature that we're currently seeing.
Yeah.
So the temperature that this concentration will reflect, we don't know when that's going to happen. But when you look at the Paleorecord, when you see the kinds of this kind of carbon dioxide level and correlate it to a temperature, it's about 3 degrees. So the idea of 2050, the idea of 1.5 degrees, is not taking into account the lag of how long it's going to take before we see the temperatures of the current levels of carbon dioxide. So having mitigation like contrails or carbon capture. Carbon capture is, I think, a good way of trying to get rid of the carbon dioxide, but it's definitely not a way to mitigate burning more fossil fuels, which is how all of these companies are using it, right?
Absolutely.
So carbon capture should be a way of reducing the 420 parts per million as much as possible, because we have no idea about what temperature we're going to get to with these levels and how long it's going to take to get there.
There are other contributing chemicals as well, aren't there? Such as methane.
Yeah.
That contribute to global warming, and you mentioned about agriculture. Are there any other sources that maybe people might think are positive, or any other sources of methane that may be a surprising source that we haven't necessarily taken into account or think about?
Yeah, methane contributes around, I think it's around a quarter of, or maybe a fifth of the total global warming factor of greenhouse gases. That is a quick and easy win in terms of reducing the amount of methane that's released into the atmosphere. A significant proportion of that comes from agriculture, and shifting patterns in having a more plant-based diet would make a massive difference to that, except for rice, right? So rice produces a lot of methane. So when we're thinking about becoming vegan, we should be thinking also about, whether we're eating foods that contribute to global warming. It's not just animal products, right? Mm-hmm. When we have a look at the different gases that contribute in terms of the greenhouse effect, F gases are one of the things that used to be a big problem with ozone layer.
So what was the word F gases?
Yeah, the F gases are a family of gases which can have up to 100,000 times equivalent of carbon dioxide for every molecule. And they
So are they things like chlorofluorocarbons?
that's right, yeah. So HFCs, HFAs, the kinds of things that we used to have in fridges, and then they were banned, CFCs. And surprisingly, some of those gases were still used in Nike Air trainers. There wasn't air in there. It was a kind of air gas that ate away the ozone layer, massively so. So much that they had to stop using it. So that tiny amount of gas in there was a really big issue. Um, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the main question you asked. If you can remind me.
Yeah. So the main question was about F gases, and then we were talking about the various different contributing factors. For example, methane to CO2, and you were saying.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah. So methane's an interesting one because it depends on the time scale that you look at it. If you look at it over 100 years, it's about 20 times, I think, around 20 times as potent as carbon dioxide. But 100-year timescales is relevant over 100 years, but we're thinking more about the immediate term, and over the next 20 years, it's about 80 times as potent as carbon dioxide because it decays much more quickly. So when we hear politicians talking about methane and they say, well, it's 20 times as potent, it is over a timescale that I think is too long. We need to be thinking about the effect that it has on these shorter timescales. Now, when we think about the permafrost in the boreal region in Russia, that they contain a lot of methane. And when they melt, that will release an awful lot of that methane. And that is a real danger because we can't stop that. We can't go around the whole region and light matches to burn all this methane to carbon dioxide. That would be a lot less potent. But even then, it's still carbon dioxide. So the way that the permafrost is melting is not linear. In other words, it might suddenly accelerate. And if it does that, then we'll be in serious trouble. So we have these kind of feedback loops that are out of our control, that we are not including in our mitigation strategies. We're just talking about how much we are putting into the atmosphere. We're not thinking about what potential other sources could suddenly open a Pandora's box of other greenhouse gases that are out of our control, that need to be included in the totals that are going to be in the atmosphere.
Yeah, I was just thinking. You mentioned a while back about the Paleorecord. Would you just mind explaining a little bit about what that is? Because obviously, it's quite a significant thing for our understanding of temperature records, is it not?
Yeah, you're right. If we were to have a look at over the past, let's say 20,000 years, we can see the carbon dioxide levels going up and down with a kind of a cycle. And then we had this Holocene period. Over the last 10,000 years, this kind of cycling stopped and it stabilized. The temperature stabilized for about 10,000 years. And that was what enabled human civilization to grow, to get what we have today, to predict the weather and the seasons. And that allowed us to settle and create cities. So instead of foraging for food for 15 people in a tribe, we were thinking about having a farm to feed 1,000 people. So that stability enabled human civilization as we know it to happen. Only over the last 150 years has suddenly this spike out of totally unprecedented in the record happened. We know all of this data from ice cores. When you drill through ice, the ice has been produced with layers over time, and they have tiny little bubbles inside. And when you look at the bubbles, the air inside the bubbles, you can determine how much carbon dioxide there was.
You can see that yourself if you just make ice cubes in the fridge.
That's right.
Yeah. You can look at the bubbles. When you're so that's a
it's a nice little home experiment to do. But yeah, these little bubbles of gas can tell you about the composition of the atmosphere at different times, and the temperature as well. But yeah, this stability allowed human civilization, and we just kicked ourselves right out of that stable zone. And that's why people are talking about the fate of human civilization, because when we've disrupted it so much, suddenly seasons are going to change, the weather is going to change, the ability to grow food is going to change. All of those things that we were using to our benefit as human civilization are now being thrown out of the window. And so when we talk about the fate of human civilization, it really is the fate of it. And we can see that when we look at the record. If we were to look back before even Homo sapiens were on Earth, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere didn't get anywhere near where we are now for 3 million years. So, yeah, it's crazy the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere now. We don't see it because of this lag thing I was talking about, but it's soon going to catch up with us.
I guess reference to the sort of lag concept and things like that. Some people may have misinterpretations of the science, whether that be deliberate or accidental. Are there any sort of common myths that come up, or anything that you kind of hear from maybe students or in general discussions that kind of are worth talking about and addressing?
Yeah, working at Imperial College, a lot of the students want to work for the big companies. The big companies, no doubt, are going to be fossil fuel related in some way, whether that be banks or fossil fuel companies themselves. And there is even here a total misconception of what these companies know, and it's almost as though students here feel that if they were to work for a company like that, all they'd need to do is educate them about the climate crisis, and they would sort it out. Right. So they've known about the effect of greenhouse gases since the 50s. And we know in 1988, the Shell report, the greenhouse gas, really explicitly said, if we put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, human civilization might be at risk, right? So they've known about this for decades. They've chosen
and ExxonMobil as well.
Yeah.
ExxonMobil were had a similar sort of report.
That's
as well.
Right. And I would say a really big misconception here is that these fossil fuel companies are good at heart, and they will do the right thing as long as they know what they need to do. This concept of greenwash is so dangerous. You can see all of their marketing about, we're doing our best about the climate crisis. Meanwhile, they're funding coal extraction at a much greater scale than they're doing anything about it. That takes quite a lot of time to figure out. And it sounds like a conspiracy theory when you just say it without any evidence. But if you look at the way that the discourse has changed from fossil fuel companies and banks and people who rely on a toxic product to make profits, they all follow the same rule book. And it was about doubting the science. And now they can't do that anymore. It's about delaying the science. It's about delaying action. So there's a big shift in how they have been trying to keep their business as usual. And the students here don't know that and don't see it.
I guess that's kind of where a lot of the narrative around the 2050 is coming out. Okay, so we'll delay it to 2050 when in reality 2025 is the sort of goal that we should be having, right?
I unfortunately I think it's even more complicated than that, because I think the UK has blown our budget, and so I think have many countries. Other countries, if we were to talk about a global budget, have more in the bank. But I think that Western countries, if you look at cumulative emissions, have blown our budget. And I don't think that our government is taking that on board. And rather than having targets about getting to certain carbon emissions and using loads of tricks like tree planting schemes, which might even have a 5% success rate, when those statistics aren't taken into account, these targets become meaningless. And it's about saying, we will do this so that we can mess around now. That's the totally wrong way to deal with it. Instead, it should be, we're going to do something now so that if we have the budget, we can do something in the future. It's backwards in my view. And the idea of other countries having more in their carbon budget than we do, that hasn't come across in any of the discussions I've heard.
And I've read recently about like the issues with regard to almost carbon offsetting, that sometimes that these projects have very good kind of goals in mind, like planting trees, but sometimes trees get affected by disease. So you're almost banking on this fantastic solution that ends up, like Dutch elm disease wiping out all the trees, or even acid rain destroying the roots of trees and wiping out whole swathes of these carbon storage systems. So those things that we are possibly relying on are problematic. Another thing that I recently, I think it was on the news, was talking about plastic waste, and so countries like China and Singapore, the Philippines are now sending back the waste to countries like the UK and the United States, and sending back hundreds of thousands of tons of waste because it can't be recycled, and they don't want to be the world's recycling bin. So what do we do with all of that waste?
Yeah, that's a good question. The UK produces a per capita the second highest rate of plastic consumption in the world after the USA. It's estimated around 2 billion tons of waste is produced around the globe every year, and half of that's burned. Now, it doesn't matter where it's burned in terms of atmospherics, right? So if it goes into the atmosphere, then it goes into the atmosphere. And the UK's approach to our big waste problem is about giving it to, or selling it to other countries to burn instead of us, so that we don't include it in our carbon emissions.
That seems a little bit messed up.
It is totally,
and very deceptive.
We saw in the Earthshot Prize that was televised, which I wasn't very happy with. One of the solutions that they spent about 10-15 minutes on within the hour-long show was an incinerator in Denmark that they had put this plastic grass ski slope on. So they were focusing on the ski slope and saying, oh, now this flat country has a ski slope, isn't that great? Which is literally carpeted over burning plastic. And they're all named eco parks because when you burn plastic, you can produce electricity. And in the UK, we get about 2% of our electricity from incineration. But what we don't think about is the air pollutants that come out of these things. Incinerators are 3 times more likely to be built in poorer areas. There's health effects that come with that. So rather than the solution being how can we reduce consumption and waste. It's how can we sweep it under the rug.
So, well, I mean, it's been an interesting but also quite disturbing talk, and I hope that over the course of COP, that maybe some actual solutions to some of these issues and are taken into account. Any sort of final thoughts that you'd like to leave people with, or any sort of extra source of information that people can start having a look at based on what we've talked about today?
Yeah, I've written up a lot of the things that I've mentioned here in a easier format, and it's got a lot more information and links to the papers where I got the statistics from. And you can find that if you go to a search engine and type "scientists for XR air pollution." It'll come up. So that's a good resource. And if you have conversations with people about statistics around, especially in the UK, about burning wood, that would really help to curb this fashion that's killing people.
Thank you very much. Well, that was an amazing conversation, Pete. Thank you very much for your valuable time, and hopefully see you soon.
Pleasure. Cheers.